Welcome to Dweller of the Dark. We are a channel honoring the yellowed and blackened bones of many prominent authors. We will be digging up several obscure, strange, and forgotten authors who influenced many of the great horror, science fiction, and fantasy writers today. More tales of the horrifying, obscure, strange, and forgotten, or climbing out of the tombs. Subscribe, comment, like, donate, or I'll send Thaddeus Forge to steal your heathen soul. Unknown horror masters, send us ghoulish delights for the Skull and Bones collection. Your pound of writer's flesh will continue to feed our ghouls for now. Books, websites, podcasts, in the links below. Children of Horror, Legion of Ghouls. Tonight, the season of Halloween has arrived. Each day, night, or hell, whenever the spirit commands us, we'll be presenting all manner of Halloween-themed tales, short stories, a novel or two, and much more. Tonight, The Haunted Oak by paullawrencedunbar, published in 1913 for The Complete Poems of Paul Laurence Dunbar. Pray, why are you so bare, so bare? Oh, bough of the old oak tree. And why, when I go through the shade you throw, runs a shudder over me? My leaves were green as the best I trode, and sap ran free in my veins. But I saw in the moonlight dim and weird a guiltless victim's pains. I bent me down to hear his sigh. I shook with his gurgling moan, and I trembled sore when they rode away and left him here alone. They charged him with the old crime and set him fast in jail. Oh, why does the dog howl all night long? And why does the night wind wail? He prayed his prayer and he swore his oath, and he raised his hand to the sky. But the beat of hoofs smote on his ear, and the steady tread drew nigh. Who is it rides by night, over the moonlit road? And what is the spur that keeps the pace? What is the galling goad? And now they beat at the prison door. Oh, keeper, do not stay. We are friends of him whom you hold within, and we fain would take him away from those who ride fast on our heels with mind to do him wrong. They have no care for his innocence, and the rope they bear is long. They have fooled the jailer with lying words. They have fooled the man with lies. The bolts unbar, the locks are drawn, and the great door open flies. Now they have taken him from the jail, and hard and fast they ride, and the leader laughs low down in his throat as they halt my trunk beside. Oh, the judge, he wore a mask of black, and the doctor one of white, and the minister with his oldest son was curiously bedight. Oh, foolish man, why weep you now? 'Tis but a little space, and the time will come when these shall dread the memory of your face. I feel the rope against my bark, and the weight of him in my grain. I feel in the throe of his final woe the touch of my own last pain. And nevermore shall leaves come forth on the bough that bears the band. I am burned with dread, I am dried and dead from the curse of a guiltless man. And ever the judge rides by, and goes to hunt the deer. And ever another rides his soul in the guise of a mortal fear. And ever the man he rides me hard, and never a night stays he. If I feel his curse as a haunted bough on the trunk of a haunted tree. The Stolen Child by William Butler Yeats. First published in 1886 for the Irish Monthly. Where dips the rocky highland of Sleuth Wood in the lake, there lies a leafy island where flapping herons wake the drowsy water rats. There we've hid our fairy vats, full of berries and of reddest stolen cherries. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand. For the world's more full of weeping than you can understand, where the wave of moonlight glosses the dim gray sands with light. Far off by furthest Rosses, we foot it all the night, weaving olden dances, mingling hands and mingling glances, till the moon has taken flight. To and fro we leap and chase the frothy bubbles, while the world is full of troubles and anxious in its sleep. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand, where the wandering water gushes from the hills above Glencar, in pools among the rushes that scarce could bathe a star. We seek for slumbering trout, and whispering in their ears, give them unquiet dreams, leaning softly out from ferns that drop their tears over the young streams. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Away with us, he's going, the solemn-eyed. He'll hear no more the lowing of the calves on the warm hillside, or the kettle on the hob sing peace into his breast, or see the brown mice bob round and round the oatmeal chest. For he comes, the human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than he can understand. The Moonlit Road by Ambrosebierce. 1. Statement of Joel Hetman, Jr. I am the most unfortunate of men, rich, respected, fairly well educated, and of sound health, with many other advantages, usually valued by those having them and coveted by those who have them not. I sometimes think that I should be less unhappy if they had been denied me, for then the contrast between my outer and my inner life would not be continually demanding a painful attention. In the stress of privation and the need of effort, I might sometimes forget the somber secret, ever baffling the conjecture that it compels. I am the only child of Joel and Julia Hetman. The one was a well-to-do country gentleman, the other a beautiful and accomplished woman to whom he was passionately attached, with what I know now to have been a jealous and exacting devotion. The family home was a few miles from Nashville, Tennessee, a large, irregularly built dwelling of no particular order of architecture, a little way off the road, in a park of trees and shrubbery. At the time of which I write, I was 19 years old, a student at Yale. One day I received a telegram from my father of such urgency that in compliance with its unexplained demand, I left at once for home. At the railway station in Nashville, a distant relative awaited me to apprise me of the reason for my recall. My mother had been barbarously murdered. Why and by whom, none could conjecture. But the circumstances were these. My father had gone to Nashville, intending to return the next afternoon. Something prevented his accomplishing the business in hand, so he returned on the same night, arriving just before the dawn. In his testimony before the coroner, he explained that having no latchkey and not caring to disturb the sleeping servants, he had, with no clearly defined intention, gone round to the rear of the house. As he turned an angle of the building, he heard a sound as of a door gently closed and saw in the darkness, indistinctly, the figure of a man, which instantly disappeared among the trees of the lawn. A hasty pursuit and brief search of the grounds, in the belief that the trespasser was someone secretly visiting a servant, proving fruitless, he entered at the unlocked door and mounted the stairs to my mother's chamber. Its door was open, and stepping into black darkness, he fell headlong over some heavy object on the floor. I may spare myself the details. It was my poor mother, dead of strangulation by human hands. Nothing had been taken from the house. The servants had heard no sound, and excepting those terrible finger marks upon the dead woman's throat, dear God, that I might forget them, no trace of the assassin was ever found. I gave up my studies and remained with my father, who, naturally, was greatly changed. Always of a sedate, taciturn disposition, he now fell into so deep a dejection that nothing could hold his attention, yet anything, a footfall, the sudden closing of a door, aroused in him a fitful interest. One might have called it an apprehension. At any small surprise of the senses, he would start visibly and sometimes turn pale, then relapse into a melancholy apathy, deeper than before. I suppose he was what is called a nervous wreck. As to me, I was younger then than now. There is much in that. Youth is Gilead, in which is balm for every wound. Ah, that I might again dwell in that enchanted land. Unacquainted with grief, I knew not how to appraise my bereavement. I could not rightly estimate the strength of the stroke. One night, a few months after the dreadful event, my father and I walked home from the city. The full moon
was about 3 hours above the eastern horizon. The entire countryside had the solemn stillness of a summer night. Our footfalls and the ceaseless song of the katydids were the only sound aloof. Black shadows of bordering trees lay athwart the road, which, in the short reaches between, gleamed a ghostly white. As we approached the gate to our dwelling, whose front was in shadow and in which no light shone, my father suddenly stopped and clutched my arm, saying, hardly above his breath, God, what is that?" "I hear nothing," I replied. "But see," he said, pointing along the road directly ahead. I said, "Nothing is there. Come, Father, let us go in. You are ill." He had released my arm and was standing rigid and motionless in the center of the illuminated roadway, staring like one bereft of sense. His face in the moonlight showed a pallor and fixity inexpressibly distressing. I pulled gently at his sleeve, but he had forgotten my existence. Presently, he began to retire backward, step by step, never for an instant removing his eyes from what he saw, or thought he saw. I turned half round to follow, but stood irresolute. I do not recall any feeling of fear, unless a sudden chill was its physical manifestation. It seemed as if an icy wind had touched my face and enfolded my body from head to foot. I could feel the stir of it in my hair. At that moment, my attention was drawn to a light that suddenly streamed from an upper window of the house. One of the servants, awakened by what mysterious premonition of evil who can say, and in obedience to an impulse that she was never able to name, had lit a lamp. When I turned to look for my father, he was gone. In all the years that have passed, no whisper of his fate has come across the borderland of conjecture from the realm of the unknown. 2. Statement of Caspar Grattan. Today, I am said to live. Tomorrow, here in this room, will lie a senseless shape of clay that all too long was I. If anyone lift the cloth from the face of that unpleasant thing, it will be in gratification of a mere morbid curiosity. Some, doubtless, will go further and inquire, who was he? In this writing, I supply the only answer that I am able to make. Caspar Grattan. Surely that should be enough. The name has served my small need for more than 20 years of a life of unknown length. True, I gave it to myself, but lacking another, I had the right. In this world, one must have a name. It prevents confusion, even when it does not establish identity. Some, though, are known by numbers, which also seem inadequate distinctions. One day, for illustration, I was passing along a street of a city far from here when I met two men in uniform, one of whom, half pausing and looking curiously into my face, said to his companion, "That man looks like 767. Something in the number seemed familiar and horrible. Moved by an uncontrollable impulse, I sprang into a side street and ran until I fell exhausted in a country lane. I have never forgotten that number, and always it comes to memory, attended by gibbering, obscenity, peals of joyless laughter, the clang of iron doors. So I say a name, even if self-bestowed, is better than a number. In the register of the potter's field, I shall soon have both. What wealth! Of him who shall find this paper, I must beg a little consideration. It is not the history of my life, the knowledge to write that is denied me. This is only a record of broken and apparently unrelated memories, some of them as distinct and sequent as brilliant beads upon a thread, others remote and strange, having the character of crimson dreams, with interspaces blank and black, witch fires glowing still and red in a great desolation. Standing upon the shore of eternity, I turned for a last look landward over the course by which I came. There are 20 years of footprints fairly distinct, the impressions of bleeding feet. They lead through poverty and pain, devious and unsure, as of one staggering beneath a burden, remote, unfriended, melancholy, slow. Ah, the poet's prophecy of me, how admirable, how dreadfully admirable. Backward beyond the beginning of this Via Dolorosa, this epic of suffering with episodes of sin, I see nothing clearly. It comes out of a cloud. I know that it spans only 20 years, yet I am an old man. One does not remember one's birth. One has to be told. But with me, it was different. Life came to me full-handed and dowered me with all my faculties and powers. Of a previous existence, I know no more than others, for all have stammering intimations that may be memories and may be dreams. I know only that my first consciousness was of maturity in body and mind, a consciousness accepted without surprise or conjecture. I merely found myself walking in a forest, half-clad, footsore, unutterably weary and hungry. Seeing a farmhouse, I approached and asked for food, which was given me by one who inquired my name. I did not know, yet knew that all had names. Greatly embarrassed, I retreated, and night coming on, lay down in the forest and slept. The next day I entered a large town, which I shall not name, nor shall I recount further incidents of the life that is now to end, a life of wandering, always and everywhere haunted by an overmastering sense of crime in punishment of wrong, and of terror in punishment of crime. Let me see if I can reduce it to narrative. I seem once to have lived near a great city, a prosperous planter, married to a woman whom I loved and distrusted. We had, it sometimes seems, one child, a youth of brilliant parts and promise. He is at all times a vague figure, never clearly drawn, frequently altogether out of the picture. One luckless evening it occurred to me to test my wife's fidelity in a vulgar, commonplace way familiar to everyone who has acquaintance with the literature of fact and fiction. I went to the city, telling my wife that I should be absent until the following afternoon. But I returned before daybreak and went to the rear of the house, proposing to enter by a door with which I had secretly so tampered that it would seem to lock, yet not actually fasten. As I approached it, I heard it gently open and close, and saw a man steal away into the darkness. With murder in my heart, I sprang after him, but he had vanished, without even the bad luck of identification. Sometimes now, I cannot even persuade myself that it was a human being. Crazed with jealousy and rage, blind and bestial, with all the elemental passions of insulted manhood, I entered the house and sprang up the stairs to the door of my wife's chamber. It was closed, but having tampered with its lock also, I easily entered, and despite the black darkness, soon stood by the side of her bed. My groping hands told me that although disarranged, it was unoccupied. She is below, I thought, and terrified by my entrance has evaded me in the darkness of the hall. With the purpose of seeking her, I turned to leave the room, but took a wrong direction, the right one. My foot struck her, cowering in a corner of the room. Instantly, my hands were at her throat, stifling a shriek. My knees were upon her struggling body, and there in the darkness, without a word of accusation or reproach, I strangled her till she died. There ends the dream. I have related it in the past tense, but the present would be the fitter form, for again and again the somber tragedy reenacts itself in my consciousness, Over and over I lay the plan. I suffer the confirmation. I redress the wrong. Then all is blank. And afterward the rains beat against the grimy window panes, or the snows fall upon my scant attire. The wheels rattle in the squalid streets where my life lies in poverty and mean employment. If there is ever sunshine, I do not recall it. If there are birds, they do not sing. There's another dream, another vision of the night. I stand among the shadows in a moonlit road. I am aware of another presence, but whose I cannot rightly determine. In the shadow of a great dwelling, I catch the gleam of white garments. Then the figure of a woman confronts me in the road. My murdered wife. There is death in the face. There are marks upon the throat. The eyes are fixed on mine with an infinite gravity, which is not reproach, nor hate, nor menace, nor anything less terrible than recognition. Before this awful apparition, I retreat in terror, a terror that is upon me as I write. I can no longer rightly shape the words. See, they. Now I am calm, but truly, there is no more to tell. The incident ends where it began, in darkness and in doubt. Yes, I am again in control of myself, the captain of my soul. But that is not respite. It is another stage and phase of expiation. My penance, constant in degree, is mutable in kind. One of its variants is tranquility. After all, it is only a life sentence. To hell for life. That is a foolish penalty. The culprit chooses the duration of his punishment. Today, my term expires. To each and all, the peace that was not mine. 3. Statement of the late Julia Hetman through the medium Bayrolls. I had retired early and fallen almost immediately into a peaceful sleep, from which I awoke with that indefinable sense of peril which is, I think, a common experience in that other earlier life. Of its unmeaning character, too, I was entirely persuaded, yet that did not banish it. My husband, Joel Hetman, was away from home. The servants slept in another part of the house. But these were familiar conditions. They had never before distressed me. Nevertheless, a strange terror grew so insupportable that, conquering my reluctance to move, I sat up and lit the lamp at my bedside. Contrary to my expectation, this gave me no relief. The light seemed rather an added danger, for I reflected that it would shine out under the door, disclosing my presence to whatever evil thing might lurk outside. You that are still in the flesh, subject to horrors of the imagination, think what a monstrous fear that must be which seeks in darkness security from malevolent existences of the night. That is to spring to close quarters with an unseen enemy, the strategy of despair. Extinguishing the lamp, I pulled the bedclothing about my head and lay trembling and silent, unable to shriek, forgetful to pray. In this pitiable state, I must have lain for what you call hours. With us, there are no hours. There is no time. At last it came, a soft, irregular sound of footfalls on the stairs. They were slow, hesitant, uncertain, as of something that did not see its way. To my disordered reason, all the more terrifying for that, as the approach of some blind and mindless malevolence to which is no appeal. I even thought that I must have left the hall lamp burning, and the groping of this creature proved it a monster of the night. This was foolish and inconsistent with my previous dread of the light. But what would you have? Fear has no brains. it is an idiot. The dismal witness that it bears and the cowardly counsel that it whispers are unrelated. We know this well, we who have passed into the realm of terror, who skulk in eternal dust among the scenes of our former lives, invisible even to ourselves and one another, yet hiding forlorn in lonely places, yearning for speech with our loved ones, yet dumb, and as fearful of them as they of us. Sometimes the disability is removed, the law suspended. By the deathless power of love or hate, we break the spell. We are seen by those whom we would warn, console, or punish. What form we seem to them to bear, we know not. We know only that we terrify even those whom we most wish to comfort, and from whom we most crave tenderness and sympathy. Forgive, I pray you, this inconsequent digression by what was once a woman. You who consult us in this imperfect way, you do not understand. You ask foolish questions about things unknown and things forbidden. Much that we know and could impart in our speech is meaningless in yours. We must communicate with you through a stammering intelligence in that small fraction of our language that you yourselves can speak. You think that we are of another world. No, we have knowledge of no world but yours. Though for us it holds no sunlight, no warmth, no music, no laughter, no song of birds, nor any companionship. Oh God, what a thing it is to be a ghost, cowering and shivering in an altered world, a prey to apprehension and despair. No, I did not die of fright. The thing turned and went away. I heard it go down the stairs, hurriedly, I thought, as if itself in sudden fear. Then I rose to call for help. Hardly had my shaking hand found the doorknob when, merciful heaven, I heard it returning. Its footfalls as it remounted the stairs were rapid, heavy, and loud. They shook the house. I fled to an angle of the wall and crouched upon the floor. I tried to pray. I tried to call the name of my dear husband. Then I heard the door thrown open. There was an interval of unconsciousness, and when I revived, I felt a strangling clutch upon my throat, felt my arms feebly beating against something that bore me backward, felt my tongue thrusting itself from between my teeth. And then I passed into this life. No, I have no knowledge of what it was. The sum of what we knew at death is the measure of what we know afterward, of all that went before. Of this existence, we know many things, but no new light falls upon any page of that in memory is written. All of it that we can read. Here are no heights of truth overlooking the confused landscape of that dubitable domain. We still dwell in the valley of the shadow, lurk in its desolate places, peering from brambles and thickets at its mad, malign inhabitants. How should we have new knowledge of that fading past? What I am about to relate happened on a night. We know when it is night, for then you retire to your houses, and we can venture from our places of concealment to move, unafraid about our old homes, to look in at the windows, even to enter and gaze upon your faces as you sleep. I had lingered long near the dwelling where I had been so cruelly changed to what I am, as we do while any that we love or hate remain. Vainly I had sought some method of manifestation, some way to make my continued existence and my great love and poignant pity understood by my husband and son. Always, if they slept, they would wake, or If in my desperation I dared approach them when they were awake, would turn toward me the terrible eyes of the living, frightening me by the glances that I sought from the purpose that I held. On this night, I had searched for them without success, fearing to find them. They were nowhere in the house, nor about the moonlit lawn. For although the sun is lost to us forever, the moon, full-orbed or slender, remains to us. Sometimes it shines by night, sometimes by day, but always it rises and sets, as in that other life. I left the lawn and moved in the white light and silence along the road, aimless and sorrowing. Suddenly I heard the voice of my poor husband in exclamations of astonishment, with that of my son in reassurance and dissuasion. And there, by the shadow of a group of trees, they stood, near, so near. Their faces were toward me, the eyes of the elder man fixed upon mine. He saw me, at last, he saw me. In the consciousness of that, my terror fled, as a cruel dream. The death spell was broken. Love had conquered law. Mad with exultation, I shouted. I must have shouted. He sees me, he will understand. Then, controlling myself, I moved forward, smiling and consciously beautiful, to offer myself to his arms, to comfort him with endearments, and, with my son's hand in mine, to speak words that should restore the broken bonds between the living and the dead. Alas, alas, his face went white with fear. His eyes were as those of a hunted animal. He backed away from me as I advanced, and at last turned and fled into the wood, whither it is not given to me to know. To my poor boy, left doubly desolate, I have never been able to impart a sense of my presence. Soon, he too must pass to this life invisible and be lost to me forever.
The Lighthouse by Edgar Allan Poe and Robert Bloch. First published in 1953 for Fantastic. January 1st, 1796. This day, my first on the Lighthouse, I make this entry in my diary, as agreed on with de Groot, as regularly as I can. Keep the journal. I will, but there is no telling what may happen to a man all alone as I am. I may get sick or worse. So far, well. The cutter had a narrow escape, but why dwell on that, since I am here, all safe? My spirits are beginning to revive already at the mere thought of being, for once in my life at least, thoroughly alone. For, of course, Neptune, large as he is not to be taken into consideration as society. Would to heaven I had ever found in society one half as much faith as in this poor dog. In such case, I and society might never have parted, even for a year. What most surprises me is the difficulty de Groot had in getting me the appointment, and I a noble of the realm. It could not be that the consistory had any doubt of my ability
to manage the light. One man has attended it before now and got on quite as well as the 3 that are usually put in. The duty is a mere nothing, and the printed instructions are as plain as possible. It would never have done to let Orndorff accompany me. I should never have made any way with my book as long as he was within reach of me with his intolerable gossip, not to mention that everlasting meerschaum. Besides, I wish to be alone. It is strange that I never observed until this moment how dreary a sound that word has. Alone. I could half fancy there was some peculiarity in the echo of these cylindrical walls. But oh no, that is all nonsense. I do believe I am going to get nervous about my insulation. That will never do. I have not forgotten de Grotte's prophecy. Now for a scramble to the lantern and a good look around to see what I can see. To see what I can see indeed. Not very much. The swell is subsiding a little, I think, but the cutter will have a rough passage home, nevertheless. She will hardly get within sight of the Norland before noon tomorrow, and yet it can hardly be more than 190 or 200 miles. January 2nd. I have passed this day in a species of ecstasy that I find it impossible to describe. My passion for solitude could scarcely have been more thoroughly gratified. I do not say satisfied, for I believe I should never be satiated with such delight as I have experienced today. The wind lulled after daybreak, and by the afternoon the sea had gone down materially. Nothing to be seen with the telescope even, but ocean and sky, with an occasional gull. January 3rd. A dead calm all day. Towards evening, the sea looked very much like glass. A few seaweeds came in sight, but besides them, absolutely nothing all day. Not even the slightest speck of cloud. Occupied myself in exploring the lighthouse. It is a very lofty one, as I find to my cost when I have to ascend its interminable stairs. Not quite 160 feet, I should say, from the low water mark to the top of the lantern. From the bottom inside the shaft, however, the distance to the summit is 180 feet, at least. Thus the floor is 20 feet below the surface of the sea, even at low tide. It seems to me that the hollow interior at the bottom should have been filled in with solid masonry. Undoubtedly, the whole would have been thus rendered more safe. But what am I thinking about? A structure such as this is safe enough under any circumstances. I should feel myself secure in it during the fiercest hurricane that ever raged. And yet, I have heard seamen say that occasionally, with a wind at southwest, the sea has been known to run higher here than anywhere, with the single exception of the western opening of the Straits of Magellan. No mere sea, though, could accomplish anything with this solid iron-riveted wall, which, at 50 feet from high water mark, is 4 feet thick, if 1 inch. the basis on which the structure rests, seems to me to be chalk. January 4th. I am now prepared to resume work on my book, having spent this day in familiarizing myself with a regular routine. My actual duties will be, I perceive, absurdly simple. The light requires little tending beyond a periodic replenishment of the oil for the 6-wick burner. As to my own needs, they are easily satisfied, and the exertion of an occasional trip down the stairs is all I must anticipate. At the base of the stairs is the entrance room. Beneath that is 20 feet of empty shaft. Above the entrance room, at the next turn of the circular iron staircase, is my storeroom, which contains the cask of fresh water and the food supplies, plus linens and other daily needs. Above that, again, another spiral of those
Interminable stairs.
is the oil room, completely filled with the tanks from which I must feed the wicks. Fortunately, I perceive that I can limit my descent to the storeroom to once a week if I choose, for it is possible for me to carry sufficient provisions in one load to supply both myself and Neptune for such a period. As to the oil supply, I need only to bring up 2 drums every 3 days, and thus ensure a constant illumination. If I choose, I can place a dozen or more spare drums on the platform near the light, and thus provide for several weeks to come. So it is that in my daily existence, I can limit my movements to the upper half of the lighthouse. That is to say, the 3 spirals opening on the topmost 3 levels. The lowest is my living room, and it is here, of course, that Neptune is confined the greater part of the day. Here, too, that I plan to write at a desk near the wall slit that affords a view of the sea without. The second highest level is my bedroom and kitchen combined. Here, the weekly rations of food and water are contained in cupboards for that purpose. Here, too, is the ingenious stove fed by the self-same oil that lights the beacon above. The topmost level is the service room, giving access to the light itself and to the platform surrounding it. Since the light is fixed and its reflectors set, there is no need for me ever to ascend to the platform save when replenishing the oil supply or making a repair or adjustment as per the written instructions, a circumstance which may well never arise during my stay here. Already I have carried enough oil, water, and provender to the upper levels to last me for an entire month. I need stir from my 2 rooms only to replenish the wicks. For the rest, I am free, utterly free. My time is my own, and in this lofty realm I rule as king. Although Neptune is my only living subject, I can well imagine that I am sovereign o'er all I see, ocean below and stars above. I am master of the sun that rises in rubicund radiance from the sea at dawn, emperor of wind and monarch of the gale, sultan of the waves that sport or roar in roiling torrents about the base of my palace pinnacle. I command the moon in the heavens, and the very ebb and flow of the tide does homage to my reign. But enough of fancies. The grot warned me to refrain from morbid or from grandiose speculation. Now I shall take up, in all earnestness, the task that lies before me. Yet this night, as I sit before the window in the starlight, the tide sweeping against these lofty walls can only echo my exultation. I am free, and at last alone. January 11th. A week has passed since my last entry in this diary, and as I read it over, I can scarce comprehend that it was I who penned those words. Something has happened, the nature of which lies unfathomed. I have worked, eaten, slept, replenished the wicks twice. My outward existence has been placid. I can ascribe the alteration in my feelings to naught but some inner alchemy, enough to say that a disturbing change has taken place. Alone, I, who breathe the word as if it were some mystic incantation bestowing peace, have come, I realize it now, to loathe the very sound of the syllables, and the ghastliness of meaning I know full well. It is a dismaying, it is a dreadful thing to be alone, truly alone, as I am, with only Neptune to exist beside me, and by his breathing presence remind me that I am not the sole inhabitant of a blind and senseless universe. The sun and stars that wheel overhead in their endless cycle seem to rush across the horizon unheeding, and of late unheeded, for I cannot fix my mind upon them with normal constancy. The sea that swirls or ripples below me is naught but a purposeless chaos of utter emptiness. I thought myself to be a man of singular self-sufficiency, beyond the petty needs of a boring and banal society. How wrong I was! For I find myself longing for the sight of another face, the sound of another voice, the touch of other hands, whether they offer caresses or blows. Anything for reassurance that my dreams are indeed false and that I am not actually alone. And yet I am, and I will be. The world is 200 miles away. I will not know it again for an entire year, and it in turn, but no more. I cannot put down my thoughts while in the grip of this morbid mood. January 13th. 2 more days, 2 more centuries have passed. Can it be less than 2 weeks since I was immured in this prison tower? I mount the turret of my dungeon and gaze at the horizon. I am not hemmed in by bars of steel, but by columns and pillars and webs of wild and raging water. The sea has changed. Gray skies have wrought a wizardry so that I stand surrounded by a tumult that threatens to become a tempest. I turn away, for I can bear no more, and descend to my room. I seek to write. The book is bravely begun, but of late I can bring myself to do nothing constructive or creative, and in a moment I fling aside my pen and rise to pace, to endlessly pace the narrow, circular confines of my tower of torment. Wild words, these, and yet I am not alone in my affliction. Neptune the loyal, the calm, the placid, feels it too. Perhaps it is but the approach of the storm that agitates him so. For nature bears closer kinship with the beast. He stays constantly at my side, whining now, and the muffled roaring of the waves without our prison causes him to tremble. There is a chill in the air that our stove cannot dissipate, but it is not cold that oppresses him. I have just mounted to the platform and gazed out at the spectacle of gathering storm. The waves are fantastically high. They sweep against the lighthouse in titanic tumult. These solid walls of stone shudder rhythmically with each onslaught. The churning sea is gray no longer. The water is black as basalt and as heavy. The sky's hue has deepened so that at the moment no horizon is visible. I am surrounded by a billowing blackness thundering against me. Back below now, as lightning flickers, the storm will break soon, and Neptune howls piteously. I stroke his quivering flanks, but the poor animal shrinks away. It seems that he fears even my presence. Can it be that my own features betray an equal agitation? I do not know. I only feel that I am helpless, trapped here, and awaiting the mercy of the storm. I cannot write much longer, and yet I will set down a further statement. I must, if only to prove to myself that reason again prevails. In writing of my venture up to the platform, my viewing of the sea and sky, I omitted to mention the meaning of a single moment that came upon me as I gazed down at the black and boiling madness of the waters below. A wild and willful craving to become one with it. But why should I disguise the naked truth? I felt an insane impulse to hurl myself into the sea. It has passed now. Passed, I pray, forever. I did not yield to this perverse prompting, and I am back here in my quarters, writing calmly once again. Yet the fact remains. The hideous urge to destroy myself came suddenly, and with the force of one of those monstrous waves. And what I forced myself to realize was the meaning of my demented desire. It was that I sought escape from loneliness. It was as if by mingling with the sea and the storm, I would no longer be alone. But I defy the elements. I defy the powers of the earth and of the heavens. Alone I am. Alone I must be. And come what may, I shall survive. My laughter rises above all your thunder. So, ye spirits of the storm, blow, howl, rage, hurl your watery weight against my fortress. I am greater than you in all your powers. But wait, Neptune. Something has happened to the creature. I must attend him. January 16th. The storm is abated. I am back at my desk now, alone. Truly alone. I have locked poor Neptune in the storeroom below. Your unfortunate beast seems driven out of his wits by the forces of the storm. When last I wrote, he was worked into a frenzy, whining and pawing and wheeling in circles. He was incapable of responding to my commands, and I had no choice but to literally drag him down the stairs by the scruff of his neck and incarcerate him in the storeroom where he could not come to harm. I own that concern for my safety was involved. The possibility of being imprisoned in this lighthouse with a mad dog must be avoided. His howls throughout the storm were pitiable indeed, but now he is silent. When last I ventured to gaze into the room, I perceived him sleeping, and I trust that rest and calm will restore him to my full companionship as before. Companionship! How shall I describe the horrors of the storm I faced alone? In this diary entry, I have prefaced a date, January 16th, but that is merely a guess. The storm has swept away all track of time. Did it last a day, 2 days, 3? As I now surmise, a week or a century? I do not know. I know only an endless raging of waters that threatened time and again to engulf the very pinnacle of the lighthouse. I know only an eternity of ebony, an eon of billowing black composed of sea and sky commingled. I only know that there were times when my own voice outroared the storm. And how can I convey the cause of that? There was a time, perhaps a full day, perhaps much longer, when I could not bear to rise from my couch, but lay with my face buried in the pillows, weeping like a child. But mine were not the pure tears of childhood innocence. Call them, rather, the tears of Lucifer upon the realization of his eternal fall from grace. It seemed to me that I was truly the victim of an endless damnation, condemned forever to remain a prisoner in a world of thunderous chaos. There is no need to write of the fancies and fantasies which assailed me through those unhallowed hours. At times I felt that the lighthouse was giving way and that I would be swept into the sea. At times I knew myself to be a victim of a colossal plot. I cursed De Groot for sending me knowingly to my doom. At times, and these were the worst moments of all, I felt the full force of loneliness crashing down upon me in waves higher than those wrought by water. But all has passed, and the sea and myself are calm again. A peculiar calmness this. As I gaze out upon the water, there are certain phenomena I was not aware of until this very moment. Before setting down my observations, let me reassure myself that I am, indeed, quite calm. No trace of my former tremors or agitation yet remains. The transient madness induced by the storm has departed, and my brain is free of phantasms. Indeed, my perceptive faculties seem to be sharpened to an unusual acuity. It is almost as though I find myself in possession of an additional sense, an ability to analyze and penetrate beyond former limitations superimposed by nature. The water on which I gaze is placid once more. The sky is only lightly leaden in hue. But wait! Low on the horizon creeps a sudden flame. It is the sun, the Arctic sun, in sullen splendor, emerging momentarily from the pall to incarnadine the ocean. Sun and sky, sea and air, about me turn to blood. Can it be I, who but a moment ago would have returned, regained sanity? I, who have just shrieked aloud, alone, and half rising from my chair, heard the muffled, booming echo reverberate through the lonely lighthouse, its sepulchral accent intoning, alone. In answer, it may be that I am, despite all resolution, going mad. If so, I pray the end comes soon. January 18th. There will be no end. I have conceived a notion, a theory, which my heightened faculties soon will test. I shall embark upon an experiment. January 26th. A week has passed here in my solitary prison. Solitary? Perhaps, but not for long. The experiment is proceeding. I must set down what has occurred. The sound of the echo set me to thinking. One sends out one's voice, and it comes back. One sends out one's thoughts, and can it be that there is a response? Sound, as we know, travels in waves and patterns. The emanations of the brain perhaps travel similarly, and they are not confined by physical laws of time, space, or duration. Can one's thoughts produce a reply that materializes just as one's voice produces an echo? An echo is a product of a certain vacuum, a thought. Concentration is the key. I have been concentrating. My supplies are replenished, and Neptune, visited during my venture below, seems rational enough, although he shrinks away when I approach him. I have left him below and spent the past week here. Concentration, I repeat, is the key to my experiment. Concentration, by its very nature, is a difficult task. I addressed myself to it with no little trepidation. Strive but to remain seated quietly with a mind empty of all thought, and one finds in the space of a very few minutes that the errant body is engaged in all manner of distracting movement, foot tapping, finger twisting, facial grimacing. This I managed to overcome after a matter of many hours. My first 3 days were virtually exhausted in an effort to rid myself of nervous agitation and assume the inner and outer tranquility of the Indian fakir. Then came the task of filling the empty consciousness, filling it completely with one intense and concentrated effort of will. What echo would I bring forth from nothingness? What companionship would I seek here in my loneliness? What was the sign or symbol I desired? What symbolized to me the whole absent world of life and light? De Groot would laugh me to scorn if he but knew the concept that I chose. Yet I, the cynical, the jaded, the decadent searched my soul, plumbed my longing, and found that which I most desired, a simple sign, a token of all the earth removed, a fresh and growing flower, a rose. Yes, a simple rose is what I have sought, a rose torn from its living stem, perfumed with the sweet incarnation of life itself. Seated here before the window, I have dreamed, I have mused, I have then concentrated with every fiber of my being upon a rose. My mind was filled with redness, not the redness of the sun upon the sea, or the redness of blood, but the rich and radiant redness of the rose. My soul was suffused with the scent of a rose as I brought my faculties to bear exclusively upon the image. These walls fell away. The walls of my very flesh fell away, and I seemed to merge in the texture, the odor, the color, the actual essence of a rose. Shall I write of this, the seventh day, when seated at the window, as the sun emerged from the sea, I felt the commanding of my consciousness? Shall I write of rising, descending the stairs, opening the iron door at the base of the lighthouse, and peering out at the billows that swirled at my very feet? Shall I write of stooping, of grasping, of holding? Shall I write that I have indeed descended those iron stairs and returned here with my wave-borne trophy? That this very day, from waters 200 miles distant from any shore, I have reached down and plucked a fresh rose. January 28th. It has not withered. I keep it before me constantly in a vase on this table, and it is a priceless ruby plucked from dreams. It is real as the howls of poor Neptune, who senses that something odd is afoot. His frantic barking does not disturb me. Nothing disturbs me, for I am master of a power greater than earth or space or time. And I shall use this power now to bring me the final boon. Here in my tower, I have become quite the philosopher. I have learned my lesson well and realized that I do not desire wealth or fame or the trinkets of society. My need is simply this: companionship. And now, with the power that is mine to control, I shall have it. Soon, quite soon, I shall no longer be alone. January 30th. The storm has returned, but I pay it no heed, nor do I mark the howlings of Neptune, although the beast is now literally dashing himself against the door of the storeroom. One might fancy that his efforts are responsible for the shuttering of the very lighthouse itself. But no, it is the fury of the northern gale. I pay it no heed, as I say, but I fully realize that this storm surpasses in extent and intensity anything I could imagine as witness to its predecessor. Yet it is unimportant, even though the light above me flickers and threatens to be extinguished by the sheer velocity of wind that seeps through these stout walls, even though the ocean sweeps against the foundations with a force that makes solid stone seem flimsy as straw, even though the sky is a single black roaring mouth that yawns low upon the horizon to engulf me. These things I sense but dimly as I address myself to the appointed task. I pause now only for food and a brief respite, and scribble down these words to mark the progress of resolution towards an inevitable goal. For the past several days, I have bent my faculties to my will, concentrating utterly and to the uttermost upon the summoning of a companion. This companion will be, I confess it, a woman far surpassing the limitations of common mortality, for she is and must be fashioned of dreams and longing, of desire and delight beyond the bounds of flesh. She is the woman of whom I have always dreamed, the one I have sought in vain through what I once presumed, in my ignorance, was the world of reality. It seems to me now that I have always known her, that my soul has contained her presence forever. I can visualize her perfectly. I know her hair, each strand more precious than a miser's gold, the riches of her ivory and alabaster brow, the perfection of her face and form are etched forever in my consciousness. De Grotte would scoff that she is but the figment of a dream. But De Grotte did not see the rose. The rose, I hesitate to speak of it, has gone. It was the rose which I set before me when first I composed myself to this new effort of will. I gazed at it intently until vision faded, senses stilled, and I lost myself in the attempt of conjuring up my vision of a companion. Hours later, the sound of rising waters from without aroused me. I gazed about. My eyes sought the reassurance of the rose and rested only upon a foulness. Where the rose had risen proudly in its vase, red crest rampant upon a living stem, I now perceived only a noxious, utterly detestable strand of Icarus decay. No rose this, but only seaweed, rotted, noisome, and putrescent. I flung it away, but for long moments I could not banish a wild presentiment. Was it true that I had deceived myself? Was it a weed, and only a weed, I plucked from the ocean's breast? Did the force of my thought momentarily invest it with the attributes of a rose? Would anything I called up from the depths of sea, or the depths of consciousness, be truly real? The blessed image of the companion came to soothe these fevered speculations, and I knew myself saved. There was a rose. Perhaps my thought had created it and nourished it. Only when my entire concentration turned to other things did it depart or resume another shape. And with my companion, there will be no need for focusing my faculties elsewhere. She, and she alone, will be the recipient of everything my mind, my heart, my soul possesses. If will, if sentiment, if love are needed to preserve her, these things she shall have in entirety. So there is nothing to fear. Nothing to fear. Once again, now I shall lay my pen aside and return to the great task, the task of creation, if you will, and I shall not fail.
The fear, I admit it, of loneliness is enough to drive me forward to unimaginable brinks. She, and she alone, can save me, shall save me, must save me. I can see her now, the golden glitter of her, and my consciousness calls to her to rise, to appear before me in radiant reality. Somewhere upon these storm-tossed seas she exists, I know it. And wherever she may be, my call will come to her and she will respond. January 31st. The command came at midnight. Roused from the depths of the most profound innermost communion by a thunderclap, I rose as though in the grip of somnambulistic compulsion and moved down the spiral stairs. The lantern I bore trembled in my hand. Its light wavered in the wind, and the very iron treads beneath my feet shook with the furious force of the storm. The booming of the waves as they struck the lighthouse walls seemed to place me within the center of a maelstrom of ear-shattering sound. Yet over the demoniacal din, I could detect the frenzied howls of poor Neptune as I passed the door behind which he was confined. The door shook with the combined force of the wind and of his still desperate efforts to free himself, but I hastened on my way, descending to the iron door at the base of the lighthouse. To open it required the use of both hands, and I set the lantern down at one side. To open it, moreover, required the summoning of a resolution I scarcely possessed. From beyond that door was the force and fury of the wildest storm that ever shrieked across these seething seas. A sudden wave might dash me from the doorway, or, conversely, enter and inundate the lighthouse itself. But consciousness prevailed. Consciousness drove me forward. I knew. I thrilled to the certainty that she was without the iron portal. I unbolted the door with the urgency of one who rushes into the arms of his beloved. The door swung open, blew open, roared open, and the storm burst upon me. A ravening monster of black-mouthed waves capped with white fangs. The sea and sky surged forward as if to attack, and I stood enveloped in chaos. A flash of lightning revealed the immensity of utter nightmare. I saw it not, for the same flash illumined the form, the lineaments of she whom I sought. Lightning and lantern were unneeded. Her golden glory outshone all as she stood there, pale and trembling, a goddess arisen from the depths of the sea. Hallucination, vision, apparition. My trembling fingers sought and found their answer. Her flesh was real, cold as the icy waters from whence she came, but palpable and permanent. I thought of the storm, of doomed ships and drowning men, of a girl cast upon the waters and struggling towards the succor of the lighthouse beacon. I thought of 1,000 explanations, 1,000 miracles, 1,000 riddles or reasons beyond rationality. Yet only one thing mattered. My companion was here, and I had but to step forward and take her in my arms. No word was spoken, nor could one be heard in all that inferno. No word was needed, for she smiled. Pale lips parted as I held out my arms, and she moved closer. Pale lips parted, and I saw the pointed teeth set in rows like those of a shark. Her eyes, fish-like and staring, swam closer. As I recoiled, her arms came up to cling, and they were cold as the waters beneath, cold as the storm, cold as death. In one monstrous moment, I knew with uttermost certainty that the power of my will had indeed summoned. The call of my consciousness had been answered, but the answer came not from the living, for nothing lived in this storm. I had sent my will out over the waters, but the will penetrates all dimensions, and my answer had come from below the waters. She was from below, where the drowned dead lie dreaming, and I had awakened her and clothed her with a horrid life, a life that thirsted and must drink. I think I shrieked then, but I heard no sound. Certainly, I did not hear the howls from Neptune as the beast burst from his prison, bounded down the stairs, and flung himself upon the creature. His furry form bore her back and obscured my vision. In an instant, she was falling backwards away into the sea that spawned her. Then, and only then, did I catch a glimpse of the final moment of animation in that which my consciousness had summoned. Lightning seared the sight inexorably upon my soul, the sight of the ultimate blasphemy I had created in my pride. The rose had wilted. The rose had wilted and become seaweed, and now the golden one was gone, and in its place was the bloated, swollen obscenity of a thing long drowned and dead, risen from the slime, and to that slime returning. Only a moment, and then the waves overwhelmed it, bore it back into the blackness. Only a moment, and the door was slammed shut. Only a moment, and I raced up the iron stairs, Neptune yammering at my heels. Only a moment, and I reached the safety of this sanctuary. Safety? There is no safety in the universe for me. No safety in a consciousness that could create such horror. And there is no safety here. The wrath of the waves increases with every moment. The anger of the sea and its creatures rises to an inevitable crescendo. Mad or sane, it does not matter, for the end is the same in either case. I know now that the lighthouse will shatter and fall. I am already shattered and must fall with it. There is time only to gather these notes, strap them securely in a cylinder, and attach it to Neptune's collar. It may be that he can swim or cling to a fragment of debris. It may be that a ship passing by this toppling beacon may stay and search the waters for a sign, and thus find and rescue the gallant beast. That ship shall not find me. I go with the lighthouse and go willingly down to the dark depths. Perhaps, is it but perverted poetry? I shall join my companion there forever. Perhaps. The lighthouse is trembling. The beacon flickers above my head, and I hear the rush of waters in their final onslaught. There is, yes, a wave bearing down upon me. It is higher than the tower. It blots out the sky itself, everything.
The Pavilion by Josephpaynebrennan.
During the summer months, the beach pavilion swarmed with people. Crowds sauntered up and down its front boardwalk, darted in and out of the little enclosed dressing rooms, which ran along on piles nearly the length of a city block, and in general infested every square foot of the immense structure. But during the cold months, the huge building, as well as the beach adjacent to it, was totally deserted. Icy winter winds from the open sea moaned through its darkened interior. Sometimes big waves flung themselves across the boardwalk and swirled around the base of the piles. Only a few front locker rooms were equipped with electricity, but during the summer, brilliant sun usually penetrated the slat roof, creating a clear but subdued light, which was entirely pleasant and adequate. During the overcast days of winter, however, very little light came through the roof. The inside of the pavilion became full of shadows, cold, damp, and gloomy, the last place in the world where any sane person would want to go. Niles Glendon was the exception. As he started out for the pavilion one cold, cloudy afternoon in late February, he was entirely sane. He had a reason for going. He had paid a visit to the pavilion some 4 months before, under rather unusual circumstances. Then, he had driven to the pavilion with his old friend Kurt Ressinger. Kurt, however, hadn't had much choice in the matter. During the drive to the beach, he had lain huddled on the floor in the rear of Niles' car, limp and purple-faced, with Niles' finger marks still on his squeezed gullet. Kurt had been foolish enough to refuse Niles a small loan of $500. Little enough, Niles figured, after all the favors Kurt had accepted in the past. Little enough after the dozens of times Niles had gotten him out of jams. When Niles ran into a flurry of bad luck, instead of coming to his aid, Kurt had grown distant. And that day in late October had been the finish. Kurt had finally, reluctantly, agreed to meet Niles at a crossroads not too far from the beach, which was a convenient halfway point for both of them. Once there, however, he had flatly refused Niles' request for a loan and had finally intimated that so far as he was concerned, their friendship was at an end. Niles, white with fury, had controlled himself with effort. And then, when they were parting, Kurt's car had refused to start. Masking his violent anger, Niles had offered to drive Kurt home. Once away from the crossroads, out on the deserted beach highway, Niles had repeated his request for a loan. Again, Kurt refused, and this time Niles' fury had exploded savagely. Braking the car to a sudden stop, he had whirled, seized Kurt by his thin throat, and mercilessly throttled the life out of him. After appropriating Kurt's wallet, which contained a helpful $80, he had jammed the corpse out of sight on the floor of the car and driven to the beach pavilion. It was a chill, rainy day in late October, and the big building had been deserted. Nobody had been in sight along the beach. Fetching a small shovel from his car, Niles had dragged the corpse of his old friend into the pavilion and buried it in the sand among the piles. When summer came, he knew people would be hurrying about on the plank walks, only 6 or 7 feet overhead. But he had little fear that the body would be discovered. Who would ever want to climb down from the plank walks and start digging in the damp sand at the base of the piles? During the ensuing winter, however, several fierce storms had raged along the beach. Niles had read newspaper accounts which stated that huge waves had washed inland, creating damage to shore properties. Undoubtedly, he reflected, A large amount of seawater had flooded in under the boardwalks of the beach pavilion, surging and swishing among the piles. It was possible that some of the sand had been swept about. It was even possible that his old friend Kurt had been disturbed in his rude resting place. As he drove toward the beach this dreary afternoon in late February, he was not really worried. In the first place, he was under no suspicion. He had been questioned after Kurt's disappearance, as had all Kurt's other friends, but the grilling had been a mild one, a mere routine. No one had seen him at the crossroads meeting, and no one had seen him near the beach. After a thorough investigation, the police began to lean toward the suicide theory, and of course, in many subtle ways, Niles fostered the idea. Beyond that, even if his old friend Sandy Gray had been disturbed by the winter storms, Niles felt that he could repair the damage easily enough. Nobody would stop at the pavilion till at least April. Certainly he was unlikely to encounter anyone on a raw, windy day in February. He drove down the beach road without passing a single car, and when he pulled up near the pavilion, not a living soul was in sight. As he climbed out of the car and started walking toward the beach, he was surprised at the force of the wind. It was a damp, penetrating wind, which struck through his clothes and made him shiver. Under a dark sky, the beach was a spectacle of desolation. For as far as the eye could see, great gray waves pounded far up on the empty sands. A litter of rubbery green seaweed twitched and tossed at the tide line. As Niles stood watching, a single seagull swung down out of the overcast and scrutinized him sharply with its cruel eye. He considered that an evil omen. Shivering, he walked toward the pavilion. As he moved along the outside boardwalk, he noticed that many of the wooden slats had been torn up by the wind and waves. Some were holding by a nail or two, and others were strewn about loose. He entered the shadowy building with reluctance, his feet echoing hollowly on the plank walks. As he advanced into the darkened interior, he began to wish he had not come. It seemed colder, damper, and drearier inside than out. It occurred to him that the entire building at this time of the year resembled nothing so much as a huge tomb. Glancing nervously at the creaking, half-open doors of the little dressing rooms as he passed along, he was startled enough to freeze in his tracks as he suddenly saw a pair of sneakers protruding from under one cubicle. The shoes were empty, of course, abandoned by some hurried or forgetful swimmer the summer before, and he felt angry with himself for his foolish fright. He went on, further and further, into the immense building, and soon he saw, with misgivings, that a number of the inside plank walks had collapsed. That probably meant that the wind-driven waves had very definitely gotten inside. Peering over the frail hand railing, he stared down at the sunken piles which supported the building. They appeared secure enough, but he noticed that the bed of sand was damp and riddled by puddles. Also, the sandy floor was no longer smooth and even. In some spots, the sand had been heaped up in little mounds. In others, it had been scooped out, leaving hollows. Definitely worried now, Niles hurried out of the building and returned to the car for his shovel, cursing himself for not having brought it in the first place. As he strode back along the beach, half running, spray from the big incoming waves slapped against his face. Swearing, he wiped his sleeve against his cheek. Back inside, he looked around to get his bearings. There were 5 parallel plank walls running the length of the pavilion. When he buried his old friend Kurt, he had been careful to note the exact location, just in case. Kurt was lying in the sand near the base of the 11th pile, running along the second plank walk from the left as one faced the rear of the building. Congratulating himself on his foresight in memorizing the specific location, he crossed to the second plank walk and hurried along until he reached the 11th pile. Then he swung under the hand railing and dropped to the damp sand below. It seemed colder than ever down under the boardwalks. It was so cold, he didn't mind the exertion of digging. He was probably being foolish, he told himself, since the sand at this particular spot didn't appear to have been greatly disturbed by the invading winter waves. Just to feel secure in his own mind, however, he would dig until he struck the quartz. Once he was positive it had not been dislodged, he would refill the hole, pound the sand down hard with a shovel, and depart. He dug energetically, and in no time at all was 2 feet down. The wet sand yielded easily under his shovel. Another foot or so, and the shovel should strike something which would offer more resistance. Confidently, he dug another foot. He began to handle the shovel gingerly, waiting for it to thump against the grisly remainder which he knew was there. But the thump never came. Seawater began seeping slowly into the hole, and that was all. Perspiring, he leaned against the pile and stared down into the dark hole. Perhaps, he told himself, the corpse had settled further into the wet sand during the winter months. Its own weight had forced it downward. The loose sand had yielded under the pressure, and now the corpse lay inches further down than it had when first buried. Yes, that must be the answer. Reassuring himself, he began to dig again. But after he had dug down another foot, he uncovered nothing but more sand, and now water began welling rapidly into the hole. He climbed out with a hollow, sick feeling in the pit of his stomach and looked around rather wildly. If the corpse wasn't where he had buried it, where was it? He could understand that the waves might have washed away some of the sand, but it hardly seemed likely that they could have completely disinterred the cadaver. Or could they? Taking a firm grip on the shovel, he began prowling about under the piles. In the gray light, he could see only a few yards ahead. He walked in a half crouch, peering to left and right. Once he whirled around with a pounding heart as he heard a noise somewhere behind him. It was a sagging plank bumping against the top of one of the piles. After he had prowled for 10 minutes and found nothing, he began to think that he had made a mistake. Perhaps it had been the third walk from the left instead of the second, or possibly it was the 10th pile instead of the 11th. Well, it was worth a try, since it was obvious that he would have been more apt to miscount the piles rather than the walks. He returned under the second plank aisleway and started digging at the base of the 10th pile. He dug 4 feet straight down and struck nothing. Trembling, he climbed out of the watery hole and stared around with a sense of growing panic. Either he had made a very great mistake in memorizing the location of the cadaver, or else. With a supreme effort of will, he controlled his rising hysteria and systematically refilled the 2 holes he had already dug. He would try digging alongside the 11th pile in the 3rd walk, he told himself. Quite possibly, in the gloom of the pavilion that previous October, he had counted 3 aisles as 2. He dug again, and again his shovel revealed nothing save seeping seawater. as he finally stopped digging and squirmed out of the briny pit, perspiring and panting. A new, fantastic, and utterly gruesome thought struck him, and he was touched by genuine terror. Was it possible that his old friend Kurt had not been quite dead when Niles buried him in the wet sand that day? Had the cold and the dampness revived him? Had he perhaps clawed his way upward out of the sand? Persons trapped in such situations were known to possess the sudden strength of madmen. And the sand was not like hard-packed earth. It was loose, light. Frenzied with horror at this thought, Niles began racing up and down between the rows of piles. With his terror, paradoxically enough, came insane rage. He began screaming the name of his old friend, cursing him, daring him to show himself. As he lunged up and down and in and out among the piles, a rising wind whipped through the pavilion, slamming the little dressing room doors, rattling the railings, howling shrilly under the roof. Also, the sea waves, flung at the crest of a rising tide, began swirling over the outer boardwalks. In a few minutes, the damp sand floor of the pavilion started covering with water as the wind-driven tide beat shoreward with increasing strength. Niles, sloshing in water up around his ankles, scarcely noticed. He darted about in the semi-darkness under the walks like some monstrous ferret on the trail of an elusive hare. He bolted about like a maniac, slashing at shadows with his shovel, glaring between the piles as if he saw enemies closing in on all sides of him. "You're hiding, damn you!" he screamed. "I know you're here. I'll find your filthy carcass. I know you're here. I know you're here." As he bolted and raged about, bereft of reason, the incoming tide rose to his knees and began creeping higher. He paused finally, weak with exhaustion, and leaned against a pile. It was then that he saw it. It came floating placidly out of the farthest dark corner of the pavilion. There, where the supporting piles were grouped so closely together, it was almost impossible to see. Propelled by the tide, it glided toward him, unhurriedly, face up, and grinning, faintly phosphorescent. Its fish-belly eyes rolled so far back in its head, only the whites remained visible. Minutes before, he had been ready to rend and smash it with his shovel. Now that he saw it, in actuality, swirling toward him with its half-fleshed face and its hideous lipless grin, sheer, heart-squeezing terror crowded out every other emotion. His only impulse was to escape. While a hoarse scream of madness wrenched itself from his throat, he leaped upward wildly and clutched at the overhead boardwalk. Missing, he fell backward with a great splash, jamming his leg between two adjacent piles. As he struck the water, he twisted violently, and the combined pull and impact broke his shin bone. It cracked audibly. The white-hot pain was so intense, it cut through even his terror. He screamed underwater, and his mouth immediately filled with brine. Thrashing about like a harpooned fish in the shallows, he finally got his head above water. The pain in his leg was indescribable, but as the first blinding shock of it was over, he comprehended the full horror of his situation. He was unable to move without screaming, and the water was now rising rapidly, and that ghastly grinning thing with its flat white eyes began floating toward him again. As it approached, full terror took possession of him. Momentarily, he forgot the fierce pain in his leg, forgot the water that was inching upward all about him. His only thought was to avoid having the horror touch him. When it was inches away, he lurched violently, The movement jammed his broken leg tighter between the piles and hurled him down and backward as if he had been struck with a pile driver. He plunged underwater, half unconscious with pain and terror, overwhelmed with sudden weakness. By the time he realized he was drowning, he could not make it back up. Once he almost got his face above the water, but his strength failed and he fell backward. For a few seconds he twisted and turned under the water. At length, a tiny trail of bubbles swirled upward and disappeared. As the tide continued to rise, however, it accomplished what his fatal upward lunge had not been able to do. It lifted his fractured leg between the piles and gently floated him free. Even as it had floated free, the storm disinterred corpse of Kurt Resinger stuck between piles in the far corner. Darkness came on. The wind moaned. The tide rose even higher. Round and about among the piles, swirling and gliding, went two grotesque shapes. Two old friends, bobbing and nodding together at the bottom of the tomb black pavilion.
Chickamauga by Ambrosebierce. One sunny autumn afternoon, a child strayed away from its rude home in a small field and entered a forest unobserved. It was happy in a new sense of freedom from control, happy in the opportunity of exploration and adventure. For this child's spirit, embodies of its ancestors, had for thousands of years been trained to memorable feats of discovery and conquest, victories in battles whose critical moments were centuries, whose victors' camps were cities of hewn stone. From the cradle of its race, it had conquered its way through 2 continents, and passing a great sea, had penetrated a third, there to be born to war and dominion as a heritage. The child was a boy aged about 6 years, the son of a poor planter. In his younger manhood, the father had been a soldier, had fought against naked savages, and followed the flag of his country into the capital of a civilized race to the far south. In the peaceful life of a planter, the warrior fire survived. Once kindled, it is never extinguished. The man loved military books and pictures, and the boy had understood enough to make himself a wooden sword, though even the eye of his father would hardly have known it for what it was. This weapon he now bore bravely, as became the son of an heroic race, and pausing now and again in the sunny space of the forest assumed, with some exaggeration, the postures of aggression and defense that he had been taught by the engraver's art. Made reckless by the ease with which he overcame invisible foes, attempting to stay his advance, he committed the common enough military error of pushing the pursuit to a dangerous extreme, until he found himself upon the margin of a wide but shallow brook, whose rapid waters barred his direct advance against the flying foe that had crossed with illogical ease. But the intrepid victor was not to be baffled. The spirit of the race, which had passed the great sea, burned unconquerable in that small breast and would not be denied. Finding a place
where some boulders in the bed of the stream lay but a step or a leap apart. He made his way across and fell again upon the rear guard of his imaginary foe, putting all to the sword. Now that the battle had been won, prudence required that he withdraw to his base of operations. Alas, like many a mightier conqueror, and like one, the mightiest, he could not curb the lust for war, nor learn that tempted fate will leave the loftiest star. Advancing from the bank of the creek, he suddenly found himself confronted with a new and more formidable enemy. In the path that he was following sat, bolt upright, with ears erect and paws suspended before it, a rabbit. With a startled cry, the child turned and fled. He knew not in what direction, calling with inarticulate cries for his mother, weeping, stumbling, his tender skin cruelly torn by brambles, his little heart beating hard with terror, breathless, blind with tears, lost in the forest. Then, for more than an hour, he wandered with erring feet through the tangled undergrowth, till at last, overcome by fatigue, he lay down in a narrow space between two rocks, within a few yards of the stream, and still grasping his toy sword, no longer a weapon, but a companion, sobbed himself to sleep. The woodbirds sang merrily above his head. The squirrels, whisking their bravery of tail, ran barking from tree to tree, unconscious of the pity of it. And somewhere far away was a strange, muffled thunder, as if the partridges were drumming in celebration of nature's victory over the son of her immemorial enslavers. And back at the little plantation, where white men and black were hastily searching the fields and hedges in alarm, a mother's heart was breaking for her missing child. Hours passed, and then the little sleeper rose to his feet. The chill of the evening was in his limbs, the fear of the gloom in his heart. But he had rested, and he no longer wept. With some blind instinct which impelled to action, he struggled through the undergrowth about him and came to a more open ground. On his right, the brook. To the left, a gentle acclivity studded with infrequent trees. Over all, the gathering gloom of twilight. A thin, ghostly mist rose along the water. It frightened and repelled him, instead of recrossing in the direction whence he had come. He turned his back upon it and went forward toward the dark enclosing wood. Suddenly saw before him a strange, moving object, which he took to be some large animal, a dog, a pig. He could not name it. Perhaps it was a bear. He had seen pictures of bears, but knew of nothing to their discredit, and had vaguely wished to meet one. With something in form or movement of this object, something in the awkwardness of its approach, told him that it was not a bear, and curiosity was stayed by fear. He stood still, and as it came slowly on, gained courage every moment, for he saw that at least it had not the long, menacing ears of the rabbit. Possibly his impressionable mind was half conscious of something familiar in its shambling, awkward gait. Before it had approached near enough to resolve his doubts, he saw that it was followed by another, and another. To right and to left were many more. The whole open space about him was alive with them all, moving toward the brook. They were men. They crept upon their hands and knees. They used their hands only, dragging their legs. They used their knees only, their arms hanging, idle at their sides. They strove to rise to their feet, but fell prone in the attempt. They did nothing naturally, and nothing alike, save only to advance foot by foot in the same direction, singly, in pairs, and in little groups. They came on through the gloom, some halting now and again, while others crept slowly past them, then resuming their movement. They came by dozens and by hundreds, as far on either hand as one could see in the deepening gloom. They extended, and the black wood behind them appeared to be inexhaustible. The very ground seemed in motion toward the creek. Occasionally, one who had paused did not again go on, but lay motionless. He was dead. Some, pausing, made strange gestures with their hands, erected their arms, and lowered them again, clasped their heads, spread their palms upward, as men are sometimes seen to do in public prayer. Not all of this did the child note. It is what would have been noted by an elder observer. He saw little, but that these were men, yet crept like babes. Being men, they were not terrible, though unfamiliarly clad. He moved among them freely, going from one to another, and peering into their faces with childish curiosity. All their faces were singularly white, and many were streaked and gouted with red. Something in this, something too, perhaps, in their grotesque attitudes and movements, reminded him of the painted clown whom he had seen last summer in the circus, and he laughed as he watched them. But on, and ever on, they crept, these maimed and bleeding men, as heedless as he of the dramatic contrast between his laughter and their own ghastly gravity. To him it was a merry spectacle. He had seen his father's Negroes creep upon their hands and knees for his amusement, had ridden them so, making believe they were horses. He now approached one of these crawling figures from behind, and with an agile movement, mounted it astride. The man sank upon his breast, recovered, flung the small boy fiercely to the ground, as an unbroken colt might have done, then turned upon him a face that lacked the lower jaw. From the upper teeth to the throat was a great red gap fringed with hanging shreds of flesh and splinters of bone. The unnatural prominence of nose, the absence of chin, the fierce eyes, gave this man the appearance of a great bird of prey, crimsoned in throat and breast by the blood of its quarry. The man rose to his knees, the child to his feet. The man shook his fist at the child. The child, terrified at last, ran to a tree nearby, got upon the farther side of it, and took a more serious view of the situation. And so, the clumsy multitude dragged itself slowly and painfully along in hideous pantomime, moved forward down the slope like a swarm of great black beetles, with never a sound of going, in silence profound, absolute. Instead of darkening, the haunted landscape began to brighten. Through the belt of trees beyond, the brook shone a strange red light, the trunks and branches of the trees making a black lacework against it. It struck the creeping figures and gave them monstrous shadows, which caricatured their movements on the lit grass. It fell upon their faces, touching their whiteness with a ruddy tinge, accentuating the stains with which so many of them were freaked and maculated. It sparkled on buttons and bits of metal in their clothing. Instinctively, the child turned toward the growing splendor and moved down the slope with his horrible companions. In a few moments, had passed the foremost of the throng. Not much of a feat, considering his advantages. He placed himself in the lead, his wooden sword still in hand, and solemnly directed the march, conforming his pace to theirs, and occasionally turning as if to see that his forces did not straggle. Surely, such a leader never before had such a following. Scattered about upon the ground now, slowly narrowing by the encroachment of this awful march to water, were certain articles to which, in the leader's mind, were coupled no significant associations. An occasional blanket, tightly rolled lengthwise, doubled and the ends bound together with a string. A heavy knapsack here, and there a broken rifle. Such things, in short, as are found in the rear of retreating troops, the spoor of men flying from their hunters. Everywhere near the creek, which here had a margin of lowland, the earth was trodden into mud by the feet of men and horses. An observer of better experience in the use of his eyes would have noticed that these footprints pointed in both directions. The ground had been twice passed over, in advance and in retreat. A few hours before, these desperate, stricken men, with their more fortunate and now distant comrades, had penetrated the forest in thousands. Their successive battalions, breaking into swarms and reforming in lines, had passed the child on every side, had almost trodden on him as he slept. The rustle and murmur of their march had not awakened him. Almost within a stone's throw of where he lay, they had fought a battle. But all unheard by him were the roar of the musketry, the shock of the cannon, the thunder of the captains, and the shouting. He had slept through it all, grasping his little wooden sword, or perhaps a tighter clutch, in unconscious sympathy with his martial environment, but as heedless of the grandeur of the struggle as the dead who had died to make the glory. The fire beyond, the belt of woods, on the farther side of the creek, reflected to earth from the canopy of its own smoke, was now suffusing the whole landscape. It transformed the sinuous line of mist to the vapor of gold. The water gleamed with dashes of red, and red too were many of the stones protruding above the surface, but that was blood. The less desperately wounded had stained them in crossing. On them too the child now crossed with eager steps. He was going to the fire. As he stood upon the farther bank, he turned about to look at the companions of his march. The advance was arriving at the creek. The stronger had already drawn themselves to the brink and plunged their faces into the flood. 3 or 4 who lay without motion appeared to have no heads. At this, the child's eyes expanded with wonder. Even his hospitable understanding could not accept a phenomenon implying such vitality as that. After slaking their thirst, these men had not the strength to back away from the water, nor to keep their heads above it. They were drowned. In rear of these, the open spaces of the forest showed the leader as many formless figures of his grim command as at first, but not nearly so many were in motion. He waved his cap for their encouragement and smilingly pointed with his weapon in the direction of the guiding light, a pillar of fire to this strange exodus. Confident of the fidelity of his forces, He now entered the belt of woods, passed through it easily in the red illumination, climbed the fence, ran across a field, turning now and again to coquette with his responsive shadow, and so approaching the blazing ruin of a dwelling. Desolation everywhere. In all the wide glare, not a living thing was visible. He cared nothing for that. The spectacle pleased, and he danced with glee in imitation of the wavering flames. He ran about, collecting fuel, but every object that he found was too heavy for him to cast in from the distance to which the heat limited his approach. In despair, he flung in his sword, a surrender to the superior forces of nature. His military career was at an end. Shifting his position, his eyes fell upon some outbuildings, which had an oddly familiar appearance, as if he had dreamed of them. He stood considering them with wonder, when suddenly the entire plantation, with its enclosing forest, seemed to turn as if upon a pivot. His little world swung half around. The points of the compass were reversed. He recognized the blazing building as his own home. For a moment, he stood stupefied by the power of the revelation, then ran with stumbling feet, making a half circuit of the ruin. There, conspicuous in the light of the conflagration, lay the dead body of a woman, the white face turned upward, the hands thrown out and clutched full of grass, the clothing deranged, the long dark hair entangles and full of clotted blood. The greater part of the forehead was torn away, and from the jagged hole the brain protruded, overflowing the temple, a frothy mass of gray, crowned with clusters of crimson bubbles, the work of a shell. The child moved his little hands, making wild, uncertain gestures. He uttered a series of inarticulate and indescribable cries, something between the chattering of an ape and the gobbling of a turkey. A startling, soulless, unholy sound, the language of a devil. The child was a deaf mute. Then he stood, motionless, with quivering lips, looking down upon the wreck.
The Shadow on the Stone by Thomas Hardy, published in 1917 for Moments of Vision. I went by the druid's stone that broods in the garden, white and lone, and I stopped and looked at the shifting shadows that at some moments fall thereon. From the tree hard by with a rhythmic swing, and they shaped in my imagining to the shade that a well-known head and shoulders through there when she was gardening. I thought her behind my back, yea, her I long had learned to lack, and I said, I am sure you are standing behind me, though how do you get into this old track? And there was no sound but the fall of a leaf as a sad response. And to keep down grief, I would not turn my head to discover that there was nothing in my belief. Yet I wanted to look and see that nobody stood at the back of me. But I thought once more, nay, not unvision a shape which somehow there may be. So I went on softly from the glade and left her behind me, throwing her shade, as she were indeed an apparition, my head unturned, lest my dream should fade. The Witch by Maryelizabethcoleridge, written in 1892 for the rare Fancies Followings by Vespertilio. I have walked a great while over the snow, and I am not tall nor strong. My clothes are wet, and my teeth are set, and the way was hard and long. I have wandered over the fruitful earth, but I never came here before. Oh, lift me over the threshold and let me in at the door. The cutting wind is a cruel foe. I dare not stand in the blast. My hands are stone, and my voice a groan, and the worst of death is past. I am but a little maiden still. My little white feet are sore. Oh, lift me over the threshold and let me in at the door. Her voice was the voice that women have who bleed for their heart's desire. She came, and the quivering flame sunk and died in the fire. It never was lit again on my hearth since I hurried across the floor to lift her over the threshold and let her in at the door. Thank you for listening. Have a great night.